Greetings. In this video, we're going to take a look at the location and the anatomy of the heart. Now, when I was a little girl, we had to say the Pledge of Allegiance every day at the beginning of the school day, and we were instructed to place our hand over our heart, which was demonstrated to us as being somewhere on the far left of our chest. Imagine my surprise when years later I discovered that the heart is actually in the center of our chest, directly behind the sternum or the breastbone. Now, it does point ever so slightly to the left, which is why that rule was made up, but it is actually in the middle. Now, if we're looking at the outside of the heart, there are two sort of geographical features that we need to be acquainted with because we'll use those to describe other parts of the heart later on. The pointy end of the heart that's pointing down and to the left, remember this is anatomical position, is called the apex of the heart. At the top of the heart, where all of the vessels are emerging and attaching, this is known as the base of the heart. Now, the heart wall is made up of 3 layers. The first, the innermost layer, which you can see in this light band here and in this more magnified image right here, is called the endocardium. Now, the endocardium forms a slick surface. Imagine like Teflon on a pan, a slick surface that keeps platelets from catching on anything rough and causing a clot to form. The myocardium is the next layer moving outwards. Myo means muscle, so this is where the cardiac muscle is that actually does the work of the heart. And the outermost layer is called the epicardium. Epi means covering. And the epicardium is part of the pericardium, a serous membrane, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. If you look at this more magnified image, the beige line that's right next to the myocardium, that is the epicardium. Now, let's take a look at the pericardium. The pericardium, if we look at this magnified image, is showing us this part of the heart here. So here we have the myocardium and the endocardium, and here's the epicardium. All right, so the epicardium is also the visceral pericardium. Visceral means organ, so this is the layer that's next to the organ. The outermost layer is called the parietal pericardium. And in between those 2 layers is pericardial fluid, which, if you recall learning about serous membranes in A&P1, is how we reduce friction between organs that are moving simultaneously. Now, the pericardium has 3 main functions. One is that it isolates the heart from other organs. It creates a sealed bag around the heart. Therefore, if we have an infection in the lungs, for instance, it's not necessarily going to be able to make it to the heart. The next thing that the pericardium does is it prevents friction during contraction. If one of my hands is the visceral layer and the other is the parietal layer and there's fluid in between, then as the heart moves or the lungs move in breathing, those 2 layers can move past each other because of the fluid in between them. Finally, the pericardium prevents the heart from overexpanding. If you look closely here, you can see that outside of the parietal pericardium is a fibrous layer, which is quite rigid. So in the case that the heart receives too much blood or has difficulty getting the blood out, the pericardium prevents the heart from stretching to the point where it might rupture. Okay. So the heart has 2 sides. Remember, we're doing this in anatomical position, so this is the right side of the heart and this is the left side of the heart. However, because it's tilted to the side, and also because when the heart develops, it develops in a spiral, it twists as the muscle cells are forming. The line that divides the two halves from one another is actually not a straight line and doesn't end right at the apex of the heart. In fact, from the outside, it follows these vessels called the coronary arteries and veins. If we were to look at the inside, we would see that this is the separation between the right ventricle, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the left ventricle. So the heart has 4 chambers. We're going to look at them from the outside and then the inside. The part of the heart that really looks like muscle and looks like the bottom part of a cartoon heart, this is where the ventricles are. They are the main pumps of the heart. On this side is the left ventricle, and on this side is the right ventricle. Now, they look like they're different sizes here, and they're going to look like they're different sizes in other diagrams, but keep in mind that they hold the same volume of blood. The reason they don't look the same is because of that twisting formation that we see in the heart. Now, the other 2 chambers are called the atria. Atria is plural, atrium is singular. So this is the right atrium and this is the left atrium. There's a part of each of these chambers that's more visible on the back side of the heart, the posterior view. But this part here is known as the auricle. And what that means is ear. So to somebody, an early anatomist, these looked like ears. Very strange ones, but apparently they did. Now, the atria are not super important pumps in the heart. They are sort of like waiting areas that help to put a little more blood in the ventricles before they contract. They're booster pumps. If we were to have a heart attack that damaged the atria, we'd probably be okay. If we had a heart attack that damaged the ventricles, we'd be in significantly more trouble. Okay, here's the inside of the heart. This is a frontal section, so we've cut off the front so that we can look inside. And now we can see where the ventricles are. This is the right ventricle and this is the left ventricle. Like I said, they hold the same amount of blood. This left ventricle is actually twisting around behind the right ventricle, so we can't see all of it. The line between the two, which we saw on the outside of the heart, is also where we have the interventricular septum. Inter means between, ventricles, so the between the ventricles. Septum is a like a wall that separates septum. Okay, in this diagram we can also see the right atrium. Whoops. And the left atrium. I hit the wrong button, sorry. So the atria, when they collect blood, they send the blood to the ventricles. So blood's going to move from atrium to ventricle, and on this side it's going to move from atrium to ventricle. Now we're going to take a look at the blood vessels. All right. The blood vessels, the major vessels, all attach to the base of the heart, which remember is the top. So any vessel that is colored blue is carrying oxygen poor blood. Now, in reality, these vessels are not blue, neither is the blood. This is just our way to designate it so that we can keep track of what's going on. The vessels that are red, here and here, are carrying oxygen-rich blood. So these little vessels are called the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary means lungs. And veins are the vessels that carry blood to the heart. They return the blood to the heart. So these pulmonary veins are bringing oxygen-rich blood from the lungs back to the heart so that it can be distributed throughout the body. The aorta is also carrying oxygen-rich blood. However, it is an artery. And arteries always carry blood away from the heart. The A in artery and the A in away can help you remember that. So the aorta is on its way to deliver oxygen-rich blood to the body. Now, both of these red vessels, the pulmonary veins and the aorta, attach to the left ventricle. The pulmonary veins bring the blood back to the left atrium, which then goes into the left ventricle, and then the blood comes out of the left ventricle and goes into the aorta. The blue vessels, on the other hand, are associated with the right side of the heart. These include the inferior, which means below, and superior, above, vena cava, which is the largest vein in the body, and both of these empty their contents into the right atrium. The blue vessel that we see here, this is called the pulmonary trunk, and it branches into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary, once again, means lungs. Artery is carrying the blood away from the heart. So this vessel is taking oxygen poor blood to the lungs where it can get oxygen. And the blood that's gone out to the body and has delivered its oxygen is going to come back either through the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava to the right atrium, then the right ventricle, and then goes back out to the lungs. So the blue vessels are associated with the right side. The red vessels are associated with the left side. Veins are bringing blood to the heart. Arteries are carrying the blood away from the heart. We'll get into the vessels more later. Okay, oops, there's the label for pulmonary trunk. Okay, let's take a look at the back of the heart, which is actually where we can see how the vessels connect better than from the front side. So we already looked at the pulmonary veins, the vessels that are bringing blood back to the heart from the lungs. And here you can see that they both connect to this chamber, which is the left atrium. We can also see the inferior and the superior vena cava, which are bringing oxygen poor blood back from the body where it's just delivered oxygen. And both of these vessels meet up and empty their contents into the right atrium. Now, in this diagram, you can also see the aorta, which is coming from the front of the heart, wrapping around, and it'll go straight down through the thoracic and abdominal cavity. We also see the pulmonary arteries, which right behind where my cursor is, are attached to the pulmonary trunk that we saw in the previous image. Okay, so all the major arteries, the two major arteries, connect to the ventricles. So here's our right ventricle and our left ventricle. And the pulmonary trunk, which is connected to the pulmonary arteries, you can see is attached to the right ventricle. The aorta is actually attached to the left ventricle, but once again, because of this twisting motion as the heart develops, we cannot see it. If you imagine this line continuing down and ending right here, actually right here, you can see a little bit of the valve. Here's the valve in the pulmonary trunk. A little bit of the valve that connects to the aorta. So the arteries are connected to the ventricles. So what we know so far about the blood flow is that it comes back to the heart through veins, goes into the atria send it to the ventricles, and the ventricles send it to arteries. All right, you can see the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and also the pulmonary veins. The veins here connect to the atria. All right, so we can see the pulmonary veins connecting to the left atrium and the superior and inferior vena cava connecting to the right atrium. Now, the heart doesn't get to stop and rest, unlike your skeletal muscles, and so your heart has to keep oxygen and fuel at the ready. The reason that the heart is red is the same reason that your muscles are red, or even that your blood is red. Muscles, including cardiac muscle, are filled with myoglobin. Myoglobin is red like hemoglobin, and it's also used to store extra oxygen. So all of these cardiac myocytes have oxygen stores that they can have access to. The heart also keeps fuel handy. Now, unlike most of the rest of your body, your heart relies on fatty acids as their only fuel to make ATP. So the fat that you see along the coronary arteries and veins is actually known as epicardial adipose tissue, or EAT. And so what it is that these fatty acids can be harvested by the heart to make ATP on demand. So this does not mean that your heart is unhealthy. It actually means that your heart has snacks that it can use whenever it needs them. Okay, oops, there's our epicardial adipose tissue. Okay, the next thing I want you to know is that the heart feeds itself first. So we have these vessels on the outside of the heart that are known as the coronary circulation. The coronary arteries are red and the coronary veins are blue. These deliver oxygen-rich blood and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. As the blood passes through the heart, going through the chambers, the atria, and the ventricles, there isn't enough time and the tissue is too thick for the oxygen to be delivered that way. Plus, on half the heart, we have oxygen poor blood moving through, so that's not going to work. So in order to make sure that these muscles are receiving a constant supply of oxygen, the first vessels to branch off of the aorta, remember, the aorta is the major artery that's delivering oxygen-rich blood to the entire body. The very first vessels to branch off of that go back and connect with the heart muscle. So they're branching and getting smaller and smaller, and they're delivering oxygen to every cell of the heart. Now, if we have a blockage in the coronary arteries, this can lead to what's called a myocardial infarction, or MI. It doesn't have to be a myocardial infarction. It can be a partial blockage, and in that case, we feel pain in the heart, but it doesn't completely knock us out. So we have pain upon exertion. This is known as angina pectoris. But if it's a complete blockage and the tissue dies, then it's a myocardial infarction. So I want you to imagine that oxygen-rich blood is traveling through these vessels, and it's supposed to be delivered to this tissue down here in the apex of the heart. If this vessel has buildup inside and then platelets get caught on it and stuck so that the blood flow can't move through, then all of these cells downstream are not getting sufficient oxygen. And without sufficient oxygen, they send a pain signal, which was one of the signs of a heart attack. And then eventually the tissue will die because it doesn't have enough oxygen. Okay. There are also valves at the entrance to and exit from each ventricle. So we talked about how the blood moves from the atrium to the ventricle. And you can see that there's a valve here. Its generic name is atrioventricular valve. This would be the right atrioventricular valve. Between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the left atrioventricular valve. Now, leaving the ventricle and going to the arteries, we have another set of valves. These are known as the semilunar valves. Semi means half, lunar means moon. If you look at them cross-section, they kind of look like half moons, kind of. So this is the pulmonary semilunar valve because we're on our way to the lungs. And this semilunar valve here that the blood goes through to get into the aorta is called the aortic semilunar valve. Now, we have other names. We have other names for these. The left AV valve is also known as the bicuspid or mitral valve. Bi means two, cusp means flaps. When we look at another image, you'll see that this valve is made of two flaps. This is also why it's called the mitral valve, because the Pope's hat has two pieces to it, and it's called a mitre. So the mitral valve or the bicuspid reminded somebody of the Pope's hat. On the right side, we have the tricuspid. This one is called the tricuspid because it has 3 flaps. Okay, this is a view looking down from above where we've removed the atria so that we can just see where the vessels attach. And here we can see that the valves, the AV valves and the semilunar valves are built very differently. These are the 2 atrioventricular valve. This is the one that's called the bicuspid because it has 2 flaps. And remember, it's also called the mitral valve. On the right side, we have the one that's 3 flaps, so the tricuspid. If we look at the arteries that are coming out, here we can see the semilunar valves. This is the aorta. And in fact, you can look in the valve is actually where the coronary arteries leave to deliver oxygen-rich blood to the heart muscle. So this is the aortic semilunar and this is the pulmonary semilunar. They are shaped more like cups. Let's take a closer look. So here's a picture of an actual semilunar valve. You can see that it's really like 3 cups that can be pushed out of the way, and then when they're pushed back into this position, they catch the blood and don't let it through. Whereas the atrioventricular valves look more like parachutes. So if this is the part of the parachute that's catching the air, these are the strings going down to whoever is at the bottom of the parachute. Same thing here. Now these cords, which are known as the tendinous cords, are attached to little pieces of muscle that look like fingers coming out of the ventricle. Those are called papillary muscles. And every time the ventricle contracts and the blood pushes up against the AV valve, the papillary muscles pull down on those cords to keep the valve from flipping inside out and letting the blood go through. So these are helping to support the valve. Now, when the valves close, it causes a heart sound, which we can detect by auscultation. Now, you've probably all heard a heart sound. Lub-dup, lub-dup, lub-dup. That's what this looks like when we're recording it. This is the lub, this is the dup. And each one of these, lub-dup, lub-dup, is the sound of the valves closing. The first one is the sound of the AV valves closing, and the second one is the sound of the semilunar valves closing. Now, when we hear that sound, it's not actually the valves closing that makes the sound like we're slamming a door. Rather, it is the force of the blood hitting the closed valve, sort of like a wave crashing into rocks. That's the sound that we're hearing.